let's go back. Let's go take a trip down a trip on memory lane, okay? Let's go back to June 2025, where the Switch 2 came out, and it was doing huge numbers, and everyone was buying it, and everyone was excited by it. You know, I remember, like, people like Destin from IGN, you know, going to Target and being like, oh, I see Switch 2 is on shelves. It's not selling well, guys. And, you know, that was a narrative at the time. And obviously that was never true. You know, we got numbers, you know, after that. It's the best-selling console ever. And no amount of, like, Nintendo cope is ever going to change that, right? But one of the things that came out that wasn't immediately obvious to normies that was the claim that third-party games weren't selling well on Switch 2. Like, I know Review Tech USA made a video about this. I'm sure lots of other people did as well. But there was a big push among, like, the anti-Nintendo demographics to push this idea that, like, all the third-party games were failing on the console. Now, that was obviously not true because, you know, you could go on the bestsellers page on the eShop and see that they were bestsellers. You could see that, like, they were selling out in stores. You could see people talking about them online. But no, like, every third-party game was bombing on Switch 2. Like, that was the narrative that people went with to try and downplay the console, was this idea that third-party games were not selling. And, selling less than our lowest expectations. But there was no source. There was no evidence for this. It was just some vague claim from some anonymous source that kind of defies reality, okay? Like, the simple fact of the matter is Nintendo has confirmed that third-party games are doing, like, gangbusters on the Switch, you know? We've seen an explosion of third-party support on the console, including Resident Evil Requiem, Pragmata, Monster Hunter Stories 3. We've seen, like, a lot of Yakuza games be ported over. Like, the Switch 2 has been really, really big for third-party support. Probably the biggest I have ever seen for a Nintendo console, because third parties have been, like, fighting hard to stay off this console for decades now. But with the declining relevance of PlayStation and Xbox, they've come crawling back. So, Nintendo is, like, dominating right now. You know, they're killing it. And yet, like, the industry is doing this thing. They're, like, bending over backwards. They're trying really, really, really hard to say that it's not happening. You know, like, I saw a lot of people try and say that Resident Evil Requiem didn't do very well on Switch. And that's just not true. I played the game on Switch. Lots of people played the game on Switch. Like, it's just a gigantic cope, and it always was. But now that we have hard numbers and we have hard confirmation, like, you're going to see, like, everyone else just kind of brush it under the rug. Just like the claims that, like, the Switch 2 wasn't selling well. Yeah, that's right. I bought a Switch 2. I knew a lot of people who bought a Switch 2, but they returned it because it just didn't have any games. Like, things that never happened, right? Like, things that never happened. And yet, like, this has been the rallying cry for, like, Nintendo haters, like, for the past year. Is just trying desperately to downplay the success of the console, the success of the games, the success of the third parties, like, by any means necessary. They'll read out, like, entire lists of, like, Switch 2 exclusives and try to say that, like, the Switch 2 has no games. Okay? They'll try and say, like, all the system sellers are, like, disappointing and aren't up to snuff. All while they, like, play Slay the Spire 2 and, like things of that nature. They're just completely devoid of any real credibility in the space. And I really have to ask, like, why was this ever a story to begin with? Like, why did nobody listen to good old Harman Smith when he ran the numbers, studied it and realized that, like, yeah, this is a lie? Okay, why is no one, like, kneeling and acknowledging I was right about this? Because I do think that, like, what we're seeing is kind of, like, the dying of the Nintendo hate community, where they're still coping. They still have a dedicated audience of people who want to see bad news about Nintendo. They're doing everything they can to downplay the company, and yet it's just kind of, like, it's making them look, it's embarrassing to see what they're doing now. I saw Nintendo today. The Mario Galaxy movie made more money than any movie ever that's been released in April, okay? It broke the last Super Mario Bros. Movie record. So, like, Nintendo tries to come out, and he's like, oh, yeah, that makes perfect sense, because ticket prices have been going up. And, like, immediately people started clowning on him. Because they haven't gone up that much in the past 3 years. So like, the narrative that like Nintendo tried to introduce that like, the disparity between this and the last Super Mario Bros. Movie was due to rising ticket prices, like it was denounced immediately. Like it was retarded. And that's not the only thing he said and done over the past several years that I would call retarded. But like it's becoming more common for people to like notice like the tendency from certain analysts and people to like push agendas for the company. We saw this with like Takashi Mochizuki, right? He came out and he tried to say that like what was it? That Nintendo was like slowing Switch 2 production this quarter, which is like obviously insane when you consider that like the Mario Galaxy movie was coming out this quarter and like they're gonna have huge numbers for everything that they're putting out. Again, this is another thing they don't talk about is how the Mario Galaxy movie is obviously going to serve as a glorified commercial for their actual products and raise sales for games like Mario Galaxy, Mario Tennis Fever, and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. But like, they came out and they tried to say that like the production is going to be massively reduced due to poor sales, and like there was that initial like push to try and like treat this like a credible report. But then, like, anybody who's been paying attention was just, like, looking at this, and it was just like, these numbers don't make any sense. Like, this guy doesn't have a source. This guy is just pulling it out of his ass. And, like, we got, like, lots of confirmation from other analysts in the industry that, like, yeah, this guy was making it up. And, like, that seems to be the case now, is that, like, people like that have a bad reputation and aren't taken seriously by the community. The only people who are like, who are still supporting Nintendo grifters are people who hate the company and want to see them fail. And that's going to be a real problem. If you make your agenda too well known, if you don't like pass yourself off as like a jaded Nintendo fan who just doesn't like the direction the company's taken, like there's no reason for anybody to listen to you, really. So you're going to have this, like, dwindling demographic of people who just, like, delusionally hate Nintendo for their own purposes. It's just disgusting. It is ridiculous seeing what, like, the masses are trying to do about this. It's positively disgusting. So what I want to see going forward, I want to see, like, more of a pushback against these kind of narratives. Because I debunked, like, the third-party games not selling thing almost immediately. And yet, like, we're only just now getting to the point where people are realizing that, like, yes, third-party games in general are selling very well on Switch 2. Now, obviously, you are going to have outliers that don't do very well because they're not very good or not good ports or, like, they're old, they're just not very popular. You're going to see situations like that. But, like, the idea that every third-party game was doing badly on Switch 2 was very observably wrong right out of the gate. And that is something that we really do have to, like, establish going forward, is that claims like that are ridiculous and should be rejected wholesale.